Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream of the History Valley podcast. Today, I am joined by Dr. Price, who can guest the channel. Sorry for the delay. We had to deal with some technical difficulties that took a little longer to solve than I expected, but we're here. All right, so Dr. Price, we're talking about the Paul problem today. Something that the Dutch radicals have been talking about for quite some time. Like, how can we know Paul wrote anything? How do we know he wrote his letters? How do we know he wrote anything at all that we have? And what kind of problem does that create? Like, do we really know much about Paul or not really?
Well, I would say not really. My opinion on this is that Paul answers to Simon Magus, who is known in various early Christian sources, and I think Josephus. He mentions a Simon who was a magician who hung around with Festus, Felix, Drusilla, Bernice, and that crowd, implying that he was part of their entourage and a spiritual advisor, who I would compare to Rasputin. That it seemed, and there's a bit more to that argument, but I realize that is pretty iffy. It's by no means secure. But I think the traditional view of Paul is really no better and is plagued with difficulties because for instance, the depiction of him in the book of Acts doesn't really fit, as Philip Vielhauer pointed out decades ago, with the Paul or Pauls implicit in the epistles. And by that I mean, on the one hand, if you piece together Paul's supposed itinerary from from the epistles, and you can, because there are a bunch of clues, like to the Corinthians, I'll be seeing you soon, but only after I go to this place and before I go to Rome, and so forth. Well, based on these hints, John Knox, Gerd Ludemann, and others have said, well, it looks like this is assuming these things are genuine, that this is what Paul did and in what order. Unfortunately, though, it does not match the order of events about Paul in the Acts of the Apostles. And the reason for that probably is that the author just wanted to stylize and streamline the whole business into 3 missionary journeys. Now, that isn't necessarily total distortion. You can see how a guy who hadn't had the wits to piece together all the hints in the epistles might have just said, well, this seems natural to me. I assume he did it. I got to have some narrative structure. But there still, you can't ignore the fact that this is a contradiction. How serious, that's still on the table. But when you also notice that when Paul is preaching in Acts, and there are sermons he gives, like in chapter 17 when he's at the Areopagus in Athens, it gives what purports to be most of a speech. Of course, it's much shorter than a real speech would be, but that's kind of common. And it could be the result of somebody knowing that somebody had somehow transcribed the whole thing, and the author of Acts is just kind of giving you a précis of it. That's possible, and some apologists would probably say that. But, and another one is in Acts 14 in Pisidian Antioch, and then there are shorter ones here and there. Well, there's enough in these speeches that kind of imply whoever is attributing this to Paul wasn't really that familiar with his theology, partly because the Christology appears to be adoptionistic, and that the idea of just how badly the pagans need the revelation from God, because in the epistles, especially Romans, you get the idea that the poor dumb Gentiles are in utter darkness because their stupid ancestors, though they had a kind of a residual awareness of the Creator, decided they'd rather worship the creation. And so they made idols and prayed to the stupid things, showing that they were just as stupid as in the second Isaiah. Or they imagined gods with the heads of animals like the Egyptians did. Come on. He said, and what he doesn't say, but really is implicit in it, the moral behavior of the gods of the Gentiles, Apollo and Zeus are rapists and so forth. What? And this was a dissatisfaction felt by many of the Greeks who felt this was embarrassing and tried to reinterpret the stories to get rid of that onus. Well, in Romans, Paul is saying, what happens if your gods are unworthy? Well, they're your paragons, right? And so no wonder your morality is going to sink at least as low as theirs. So the Gentiles have turned to all kinds of immoral depravity, and he starts listing some of these things. Is it any accident, given what their moral exemplars are? And this was a common Hellenistic Jewish approach, and on the basis of it, in fact, a lot of dissatisfied pagans decided, hey, this does sound better. I think I'm going to start attending synagogue. So they're bereft of the knowledge of God. It's their own fault, but God has revealed a righteousness from heaven. And that's available to Jews or Gentiles, and it's not based on the Torah, so you don't have to be Jewish to take advantage of it, and so forth. Well, in Acts 17, Hauer pointed out, Paul seems to be saying, oh, Gentiles, because that's who he's talking to, I know your people have sought for God, hoping to find him, but you never have. Well, lucky for you, I'm here representing him, and I'm going to tell you all about him. So you can really get the truth about God. That may seem subtly different, but it is more than a subtle difference. It's kind of the difference between Karl Barth and Emil Brunner, two of the great neo-Orthodox theologians of the 40s. Karl Barth said, he was kind of a Calvinist, he said, we are lost. We are dead in sin. It can't even really occur to us to want to repent and know God. When we get religion, it's just self-serving hypocrisy. We're just lost unless God breaks the silence of eternity and tells us the truth. And that's what he's done by sending his word, Jesus Christ, to the human race. It's almost Gnostic. But Brunner had this idea, well, like Arminianism or Pelagianism, yeah, we have gone astray from God, but we're like the prodigal son. The point can come when we think, couldn't I change this? Couldn't I go back to God if he'll have me? And so you're not totally fallen away. And Karl Barth wrote an essay replying to this, and the title was Nine. No. Well, that's kind of like, Brunner is kind of like the Paul of Acts 17, and Barth is like the Paul of Romans 1 through 3. And that's kind of a biggie. What is justification? Well, in Romans and Galatians, it seems to be God's free forgiveness, his accepting the punishment meted out to Jesus Christ, who didn't deserve it, but was willing to take the punishment due us who did deserve it. And since he's done that, the salvation that God offers is pure grace. You don't have to be good enough. It's not a question of that. You don't have to keep a bunch of religious rules. I mean, there might be reasons to do it, but it's not the criterion of salvation. So it's all God. You just need to extend the open hand and accept his grace, his unmerited favor. There's this great anecdote I heard an old pastor of mine use. I don't know if this is true or not, who cares? Napoleon was out on one of his campaigns, and he's in his tent one night, and I guess his posted guard falls asleep or something, but an old woman manages to sneak into the tent, and he says, "Oh, well, ma'am, what is it you want?" And she says, "Well, my son fell asleep on guard duty, just like the guy outside right now, and he's going to be hanged in the morning. I'm here to beg your mercy." And Napoleon said, "He doesn't deserve mercy, ma'am. I mean, he fell asleep on duty. You can't do that. He doesn't deserve mercy." And the woman said, "That's why it's mercy." And that's sort of a good illustration. So that seems to be, now that's like the Lutheran interpretation, but you sort of get that impression from reading the Pauline epistles, that that's what justification is. You're made, you could also translate it as being right-wised, as Bultmann points out. We don't have a good English word for that, but by being put right with God by his grace. But in Acts, there's this strange thing where Paul says in his preaching, through Christ, you can be justified from those things from which the Torah would not justify you. What are you talking about? Does he mean forgiven? Well, that might make sense, but it's like the Torah isn't quite good enough. You really need Christ to go the whole way. Well, back in Romans and Galatians, he's having to defend the law after he said, you know what it really does? It just increases your urge to sin. It's like forbidden fruit, and the condemnation you receive from having disobeyed God's law. These are not the same things, and this is kind of important stuff to determine Paul. So right there, you got a problem, two or three problems between the Paul of Acts and the Paul of some of the epistles. But it gets worse because scholars who have really put the text of the epistles under the microscope find that there are similar, if not worse, discrepancies between the various epistles, indicating again that perhaps they're not all by the same guy. One of my favorites is, where did Paul get his gospel? In Galatians, whoever, says that it wasn't from any human mediary. No, it came directly from Christ, and so forth. But in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, well, you remember the thing I stressed most of all among you, that it was what I received. And then he lists these things. Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures. He was buried. He rose again from the dead in accordance with the scriptures. He appeared to Sam, Bill, Irving, and so on. And it sounds like he's saying, this is what I was taught, and I passed it on to you. Well, wait a minute. And he says, no matter which apostles you got it from, we all say the same thing. Can you read Galatians and think this is the same guy? I mean, according to this, he did receive it from other humans. But in Galatians, oh no, I got it from no human source. And 1 Corinthians is like like Acts, right? Acts chapter 9. Paul learns about the gospel from Ananias of Damascus. That's not the impression you would get from Galatians. There are other things too, but there are when is Christ's messianic reign going to come to an end? Well, according to Ephesians, never. In this age and the age to come, Christ will be Lord. But in 1 Corinthians 15, there is a limited term. As of the resurrection of the dead at the end, Christ hands over the throne to the Father, whereupon God will be all in all, which sort of sounds Hindu to me. But there are a number of things that don't seem to square, including literary style. And in fact, you can then sharpen the focus even more, and you start noticing that individual letters are swarming with contradictions. First Corinthians being the worst of the lot. Can apostles depend on their congregations for monetary support and being fed and having their needs met? Well, according to one chapter in First Corinthians, sure, why not? I mean, God even said that the oxes treading out the grain ought to be given some of it. You know, like Marxists, and don't alienate the worker from his product. But then in the next chapter, Paul is saying, of course, I never do this because people will get the wrong idea. Well, why'd you spend so much time legitimating it and insisting you had the right to do it when now you're saying, no, that's a bad idea? Can women speak in church? According to, I think it's chapter 10, women can prophesy as long as they have their heads veiled or something. It's not clear in the Greek. But in chapter 14, no, women mustn't speak in church. If they got to know something, let them make a note and ask their husbands when they get home. Is it okay for Christians to eat meat that has been previously bought from pagan temples when they have more than the priests can eat, and they sell it to meat markets, the extra? And Christians, like anybody else, might say, oh, it's a good looking steak. How much you want for it? Thanks. I'll have it for dinner and invite my friends over. Is that okay? Or are you somehow partaking of a pagan sacrifice? Well, in one chapter, don't do it. You're still engaging in pagan worship. Okay, a little indirectly, but that's what you're doing. Remember what happened when the Israelites went to a dinner party with a bunch of pagans at Baal Peor. Over 1,500 of them died. Don't let this happen to you. But then in the next chapter, yeah, sure, it's okay as long as the weaker brethren who wouldn't understand don't know you've done it, because they're not going to get it. And they're going to say, did I just see Price over there chowing down on a steak bought from the priests of Apollo? Oh, I guess it must be okay for Christians to worship several gods. All the other members of religions do. Oh, no, we don't want him to think that. But that's what he's going to think if he sees you playing fast and loose at the pagan dinner table. And on it goes. Should you speak in tongues or not? It depends on which chapter you read and so forth. Did the same guy write this? Or isn't it more natural to assume that about half of them may go back to the original writer, Paul or whoever, and that other Paulinists who didn't quite agree with this decided to get equal time for the opposing view, and they just sandwiched it right in next time they made a copy? Seems to me that's very likely. And that the other epistles are swarming with interpolations and added chapters and so on. You can't always be sure because we don't have sufficient manuscript evidence for the period in which these things would have happened. You have to go by internal evidence. Wait a minute. How do you get from that to this? How can you connect the dots here? Was the guy a schizophrenic? And you wind up saying, I bet this is really two different authors. How else could it be this way? So there are big problems, in my opinion. And this kind of view, whether you're taking the view that the epistles are not the work of a single man, Paul, but of several people, or if you said they were all originally by Paul, but people have sewn in patches left and right. Oh boy, mainstream scholars hate that. And a couple of them come very close to admitting it explicitly. If we go down that road, we will not be able to formulate theories about the theology of Paul, or what is the center of Pauline thought, and so forth. Yeah, that's right. I mean, if you've got these signals pointing in different directions, you really have to give up. I mean, you can hypothesize about it, but it's all got to remain tentative, and the game is over. Now that may not matter unless you're retaining traditional Paulinism, where the only reason you're interested in him is that he's the infallible apostle of Jesus Christ. And Jesus, well, we don't like some of the stuff he said, but it's kind of safe to just put that in the background and zero in on Paul. But if Paul does not give a clear sound with the trumpet, who'll know what to do? And so they just can't afford to admit that. Again, if you're like me and you don't hold these things to have any authority but that of occasional words of wisdom, and there certainly are plenty of them, then in that case there's no problem. You got a very interesting intellectual problem, but it's a mind game, and that's pretty safe territory.
Do you think it's made worse by the fact that many of Paul's epistles, or what are supposedly Paul's epistles, are co-authored?
Yeah, to show you how the tradition shapes people's interpretation, when it says Paul and Silas and Timothy to the saints which are in Sheboygan or whatever, we usually have thought, well, hey, he's just being nice and basically saying, yeah, these guys are with me as I write. But that isn't really obvious, is it? I mean, it might be committee work in the same way when you have something like in First Peter, with the help of our faithful brother Silas, I have written these thoughts to you. Well, does that mean he dictated it to Silas? Could mean that. Or does it mean that he wrote it, but Silas has carried the letter to them? It could mean that. Or does it mean that Silas wrote the whole thing for Peter's signature? Well, it could mean that. It's very difficult to say. And so you're thrown back on internal evidence. You compare it with Second Peter, which cannot possibly be the work of the same author because the Greek style is drastically different. You're going to suddenly change that. And so so that is a real good question. When he says we, does he actually mean me and my buddies here? Could be. And then when he says I, he just means himself, and he can't quite keep it straight. I don't know if there's any way to tell. And that is kind of an important thing, but nobody talks about that.
That's very true. Nobody talks about it. We have a PayPal question. This was PayPal to me a couple of weeks ago, actually. Last week, actually. Sergio Zaneri, thank you for your PayPal. He says, I heard from French esotericist J.L. Victor in the 1990s footage that reincarnation was on the early Christian menu, being later scrapped at Nicaea or later at the Council of Constantinople. I wish Dr. Price would comment on the import of reincarnation, whether in canon or otherwise in nascent Christianity, Gnostics included. Thanks, regards.
Yeah, for the only ones we know in the early Christian spectrum that taught reincarnation were various Gnostics. And their view was just like in Hinduism and Buddhism. They said, you are born again and again. You're on the same old treadmill. the same sorrows and trials are going to happen again and again. I mean, not exactly the same, but you're going to get sick and the loved ones will die and you'll lose jobs and so on and so on. And then you're going to get old and start getting infirm, and you're going to lose control of your bladder, and you're going to be senile and so forth. Do you want to go through that again and again and again? It's no joyride to be reincarnated. Surely you'd want to escape that. Is there a way? Well, yeah, you bet there is. And all of these paths, said in one way or another, there is a spiritual spark inside you, and it is getting dragged along with your, what I guess you could call your psycho-mental self, your ego, which is actually material in nature, like your physical body, right? Because even thoughts are electrochemical discharges in the brain, right? So what you need to do is to slough that off, because that's what is like a cement overcoat. You're getting thrown into the drink again and again. And you don't want that. So the thing to do is to slough off that body, that psychic body even. And if you can do that, and we'll show you how, the Noble Eightfold Path, or yoga, or sacred knowledge, as in Shankara and in Gnosticism. In Gnosticism, the knowledge is the fact that you do have a divine spark, and that you can go back to your true origin point in the divine pleroma above. If you know your origin, you will know your destiny, as Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas. So you've got to accept this understanding, and you will fly away when this incarnation is over. So a lot of early Christians believed in it. I mean, some will say, oh, no, that was just the Gnostics. I got news for you. They were self-confessed Christians, right? To say they weren't is like a bigoted Protestant saying, well, I'm a Christian, but that guy over there, he's just a Catholic. Get out of here. It's just, they've been raised to think that. You can't blame them, but it's just scurrilous, really. Well, in the same way, yeah, the Gnostics had all kinds of different Christian theologies, but they all saw themselves as Christians, which you can tell from their writings, right? And so this comes up when apologists say, well, the early Christians were careful to draw a line between their teachings and those of Jesus. Oh, were they now? Do you ever read Pistis Sophia, or the Gospel of Thomas, or the Dialogue of the Savior, or a whole bunch of these Gnostic documents, the Apocryphon of James, and so on? These guys were Christians that were fabricating Jesus' sayings by the truckload because they figured they were inspired by the heavenly Christ. They weren't lying about it. Well, so that just destroys that view, but it's a kind of the apologists are wearing blinders. It simply doesn't occur to them that these Gnostics were Christians too. You got to count them into the mix if you're going to make some generalization about what Christians would or would not have done in segregating the teaching of Jesus from their own ideas, right? It just doesn't occur to them. And in the same way, if you say, well, yeah, there were plenty of Christians that believed in reincarnation, Valentinians, Basilidians, and so on, these Gnostics. Oh, but they're not Christian. What? Ask them. They said already in their writings that they're Christians. But not all of them did, right? There were some Jews who apparently believed in reincarnation. That's even implied in the Gospel of John, chapter 9, right? The disciples see this blind beggar. Everybody knows he was blind from birth. And the disciples say, Master, a hypothetical question for you. Was this poor guy born blind because of some sin of his parents or his own sin? What? how could he be born blind for some sin he had already committed? Well, Jesus doesn't rebuke him for that. He doesn't even say that reincarnation doesn't happen. He just says that question is moot in this case because this guy was born blind to serve as an example of God's grace. Because watch this, I'm going to heal him by the power of God. Well, that kind of implies that, yeah, there were some Jews even then that believed in reincarnation. Whether they assumed Jesus did or not, we don't know, doesn't say. Um, so what about Nicaea? Did they, as one often hears, scrub the belief in reincarnation from the Christian creed? Yes and no. It's not like that there were a bunch of passages in the Gospels, for instance, where Jesus talks about reincarnation. Nobody really thinks that. But it's true that around that time there were still debates about which books ought to be in the New Testament canon, and of course they gave the cold shoulder to these Gnostic works. And so it's true, you can't really find the teaching of reincarnation in the Bible, but it's not so simple as that they cut material out of the text of Scripture. It's sort of close, right? There was no way they were going to admit books that did teach that, but there wasn't a New Testament yet, right? The question of is on the table was which books are going to be in it, and those were excluded. So if you mean that, well, yeah, these early Christian councils did exclude the teaching of reincarnation, but you often hear it phrased incorrectly and sensationalistically, that it was in there, but these bastards cut it out and snipped it out, bowdlerized it. That's not true. But, again, I'm walking a tightrope here because it's almost true. They didn't seriously consider any Gnostic text that taught reincarnation to be part of the Christian scripture. It's a subtle difference, but one worth keeping in mind.
Let's get to the next one. This is from the YouTube super chat this time. Lee Melanchuk, hope I pronounced your last name correctly. It appears Mark leaned heavily on Paul. Are there theologies in Mark that varies from Paul's teachings, or at least the consistent teachings of Paul? Thank you for the super chat, Lee.
Well, depending on whether Jesus means this at the Last Supper when he says that he came to give his life a ransom for many, like that could be taken a couple of ways. In contemporary Jewish martyr theology, which you find, for instance, in Second Maccabees and Fourth Maccabees, where the righteous are in a terrible persecution and they're praying and saying, God, we know our people have sinned, and that's why you allowed the Seleucid pagans to oppress us. Well, we brought it on ourselves, but it is pretty awful. And we, these seven brothers, we're about to be tortured to death because we won't abandon the Torah and Judaism, the faith of our fathers. Would you be willing to accept our deaths on the behalf of our sinful co-religionists and call off the persecution? Does Mark think Jesus means something like that? That would be kind of like Paulinism, as we try to reconstruct it from the letters, because he does say, that because one died for all died, and so on and so on. He does have an atonement doctrine connected with the death of Jesus. He says more about it than the somewhat equivocal business in Mark. But and let's say he seems to be Mark seems to be an advocate for Paul, Now, this doesn't mean Paul was necessarily still alive, but of course, he means, Paul is the figurehead of those who follow him these days. Uh, the story about the so-called strange exorcist, as if there was any other kind, right? Where was it James and John, just John, I forget. It says, "Oh, Master, you'll be glad to know that today we saw some guy casting out demons using your name as the formula." And of course, we told him to cease and desist. He's working our side of the street. He's not one of us. And he's expecting to get patted on the head, right? Protecting the trademark. But Jesus says to him, "You did what? Doesn't it occur to you that whoever is not against us is for us? Whoever does a miracle in my name is not going to start bad mouthing me. We need all the friends we can get." Well, surely that's really about Paul. Right? He wasn't one of the actual disciples of Jesus. Forget him. No, no, you can't just discredit the guy like that. And so I think that's probably right. He's really taken up for Paul, whereas Matthew omits that. He uses most of Mark, but not that. And instead, he's got a scene set at the Last Judgment when everybody's lining up at the pearly gates, and they're waiting, and finally these guys come to Jesus, and they say, "Master, long time no see. Remember the good old days when we performed miracles in your name and cast out demons in your name? I can't wait to get inside." And Jesus says, "Gee, I'm sorry, but your name's not on the list." No, look a little further. It's got to be there. Look, I told you, I don't know you. Now get out of here before I have you thrown out. Who could he be talking about? Well, it's got to be Paul. And in the beginning of Matthew, anybody who tells people to disregard even the least important commandment of the Torah, well, he's going to be the lowest one on the totem pole in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever teaches others to keep every one of them, he'll be among the greats in the kingdom of heaven. Who could he possibly be talking about? Paul, right? He's the one saying you don't need to bother with that stuff. And so I think you can see an advocacy and an alliance between some of the evangelists and some church leaders, or at least factions. And though in terms of the worked out theology, there's still a big gap. Harnack said this, Adolf Harnack, a great New Testament scholar. He said in his book, What is Christianity? He says that why is it that Jesus teaches stuff like the parable of the prodigal son? He says, look, you're a sinner, but repent. It's not too late. God will welcome you back. You're a sinner. I know that. God knows that. But he's not of a mind to destroy you. He wants you to be saved. Come on back. Harnack said, notice that he doesn't say, and furthermore, in about 2.5 months, I'm going to be crucified to take away the sins you've committed. And if I didn't, you wouldn't be forgiven. And if you don't accept it, you're not going to be forgiven. Not a word, right? And Harnack says, well, the obvious conclusion is that the historical Jesus was not really remembered saying such things, that someone instead is trying to read back into the historical Jesus ideas that came up, or theology that was reasoned out, or whatever, subsequent to Jesus' departure. But it gives it an extra weight if you say, oh yeah, Jesus said it even before he was crucified. Samuel Reimarus pointed out the same thing. Isn't it obvious that somebody is tampering with the tradition and making Jesus into kind of a ventriloquist dummy for later Christian theology? Well, yeah, and the theology we see a bit of in Paul and John does get read back into the mouth of Jesus, but surprisingly little. I mean, it happens, like in the example Harnack gave, but they didn't really go whole hog on it. But anyway, that's about all I got to
We got
say.
a couple super chats. One that's been sent through PayPal. The PayPal one came earlier, so I'm going to read that one first. John Macker, thank you for your PayPal donation. He says, one interesting reason of many, I believe, the Gospels were unsigned and anonymous was because they were written by a committee of people simultaneously, like a community effort. What does Dr. Bob think of this?
That could be, but I don't see big discontinuities of literary style within them. Occasionally, you suddenly notice some vocabulary that isn't characteristic of the author, and that's one way to spot likely interpolations. Like, for instance, the last verses of Mark, whatever comes after they fled from the tomb and said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Everything afterward, the appearances of Jesus, uh, not only doesn't appear in the earliest manuscripts, um, and it was not available to the other gospel writers since they all go off in different directions after the discovery of the empty tomb. But it doesn't match the style of Mark. It seems to be later and more ecclesiastically stuffed shirtish, and it seems pretty clearly to be the work of another hand. The same thing with the woman taken in adultery, not in the earliest copies of John. And it sounds more like it would belong in one of the synoptic gospels, because John whoever he was, has a very distinctive, lucid, and simple style. But this doesn't. I mean, it's not bad. It's just not the same kind of material. And sure enough, it's not in the earliest manuscript. So sometimes you do see things like that, but not enough of them to make me think it was that the Gospels were committee products. I mean, that's not an outrageous idea, but the stylistic thing sort of persuades me that you had a basic writer. Now there's a shade of difference between what you've said and another plausible possibility. Where did they get the material they used? Well, you can imagine Mark or any of the others collecting stories from people. Well, I heard this about Jesus, and he fed 4,000 people with just a few bits of fish and bread. And then somebody else says, well, I heard one about Jesus where he fed 5,000 people with just a handful of stuff. And Mark's thinking, gee, I wonder which one's closer to the truth. I'll just put them both in. And you can well imagine they had various informants, but in terms of the actual writing of it, there's too much of a uniform style. But that doesn't mean that each gospel writer just cooked it up and made it up out of his own head. I mean, even if it's all fictional, it doesn't mean that one single guy is responsible for it. But I think one single guy in each case was responsible for the final narrative.
Let's get to the next one. This is from the YouTube super chat. Stephen Hazel, thank you for your super chat. Do you think this section of 1 Corinthians 14 forbidding women to speak in church was a later interpolation? And do you think Paul allows female leadership?
Well, again, it depends on what he actually wrote, but there are signs of that. It's not definitive, but in Romans 16, it appears to be a separate document stapled onto the end of Romans, and it looks like that it's just chapter 16, which is filled with "say hi to so and so for me, my relative, my old pal, this guy noteworthy among the apostles, etc." That would fit if he's trying to write a letter of recommendation for the person who carried the letter, either to Rome, as you would think, since it's tacked on to Romans, but possibly to Ephesus, some have thought. But nonetheless, that's all you would have. There wouldn't be any theological discourse in such a thing. You can trust them because I trust them, and you know me, is the idea. Well, in the course of this, he refers to Andronicus and Junia, who are noteworthy among the apostles. That doesn't seem to mean renowned among the apostles, that, oh yeah, all the apostles think highly of them. The ordinary meaning would seem to mean that they are among a group of apostles of Christ, and one of them is a woman. Now, the King James, I think, does have that correctly, but many of the mainstream translations, I think in the last 20 years this has been corrected, but many of them made it two male names, Andronicus and Junius. But the problem with that is, now the problem is twofold, I should say. It has, these nouns have case endings, and the name actually appears as Junion, A-N. Now, that could be, if you had it in the nominative, like the subject of the sentence, that could be Junius, a male name, or Junia, a female name. But we have a lot of information about that era and loads of names. I mean, names were constantly repeated, just like today. And there's not a Junia in the lot. Whereas there's a, I'm sorry, there are people named Junia, women, but no male name Junius or even Juniatus. Now there's that, but that's not known. That doesn't appear as a contraction as Junius. So the balance, who knows for sure, right? But the balance of the evidence certainly indicates that he's talking about an apostolic couple, male and female. Also, who's the letter written for? On whose behalf? He says it's Phoebe, a deacon from the church at Cenchrea. Now, in the pastoral epistles, you have a similar word, deaconess, meaning a minister or a servant, a female one, obviously, right? But that's not what it says in Romans 16. It's the male word, deacon, and diakonos. And so that certainly, I mean, she's like a leader who's come to minister among them. There are other passages where, for instance, in 1 Corinthians, the earlier part of it, where he talks about how women can pray and prophesy in the congregation. It's just that for a kind of weird cultic reason, they should make sure that their head is covered, for this weird old folk story about the angels lusting after Eve and so on. But it's okay if they do. And of course, prophesying, according to chapter 12, is the highest of the spiritual gifts. So they have that important role. But in chapter 14, as you say, in fact, I quoted this earlier, it says that women ought to keep quiet in church. And if there's anything they just have to know, let them hold their tongue and ask their husband when they get home. I can see how you might harmonize that, because the women in the earlier passage are like consecrated virgins. We know a lot about them in the early church. And they could, like the prophesying virgin daughters of Philip mentioned in Acts. That was a fairly common thing. They could minister, but if you weren't, if you were a housewife, like it says in 1 Corinthians 7, no problem with that. But if you're a man or woman, and you're married, you're not at liberty to devote yourself completely to the things of the Lord. You've got family obligations. You can't cheat your loved ones, and which is one of the big reasons for celibate priests in the Catholic Church. the Essenes thought that too. Well, so there might not be a contradiction. They may be talking about two groups of women. I find that really quite plausible. But there is one big reason to think that it's an interpolation, and that is that verse appears in two places in chapter 14, depending on which manuscript you're looking at. It's a couple of verses up in some manuscripts, but a couple of verses down. Now, that's in others, and that really makes you think, I bet that this is a gloss, a note that some copyist made who thought women ought to keep quiet and didn't think that this should give them permission, First Corinthians, that is. And so he said, well, let's make Paul more of a decorum guy. And he should have said this. Maybe he did say it and somebody left it out. Well, I'm going to put it here in the margin. So I can't recopy the whole thing, but people will read that and say, I see. Somebody missed this, and then they saw it and they put it back in. That's good. Don't want to miss any of the teaching of the inspired apostle. But the next guys to copy this, when it was getting worn out from liturgical use, they saw it and they thought, oh, I bet Paul did write this, and some previous copyist just skipped it accidentally. Well, I'm up to that point now. I will just put it in where I think it must originally have gone, and then keep going. And the same thing happened with another guy with another copy that had the thing in the margin, and he decided, oh, this must be by Paul too, but it was left out by error. I bet it would fit here best. And they had different guesses. That's hard to resist. We don't know, but that's a very tempting theory. There's not really enough of it. Not really enough of that to be sure. Not enough manuscript evidence or wording so you can check the characteristic vocabulary and so on. But there are other things too that Dennis MacDonald and others have pointed out that look like they may be interpolations, and based on the style and so forth. Winsome Monroe does a great job with this in her book Authority in Paul and Peter, where she says you can find a whole bunch of these insertions here and there. And one oddity is that it says in this little patch, women should keep silent, as even the law says. You mean the Torah? There's nothing in the 5 books of Moses that say women should keep silent. You'd think Paul would have known that. So there's another possible strike against it. So it's very likely an interpolation.
Okay, let's take a look at this next message here. Lyran, thank you for your super chat. Thoughts about Paul's letter to Hobatan? That's a video I have to show you. I'm going to play it. It's kind of a funny joke. Let me go back to the beginning.
Ads, a little bit.
What you got there?
That's me.
Let me take a look. Ancient Greek.
I don't have anything Greek.
You're holding it upside down.
Oh, yeah, thanks.
And to the side.
Okay. Let's see. Yeah. Greeting from Caesar's household. I am not a liar. Liar. I am not a liar.
Who starts a letter like that?
Oh, wait, you know this. This is from Rome, Caesar's household. We already knew that. And it's written by Saul Tarsi. Know a guy like that?
Yeah, Saul of Tarsus.
Oh, does he live in Holland?
No, it's St. Paul, one of the first Christian apostles.
Oh, wow, this must have been sent a long time ago.
Oh, yeah.
And any Israeli male was slow, but this is a revelation.
That's something different.
Huh? Wait, when was this thing written?
I don't know. You could ask Jacob. He's dating Paul's epistles.
What? I thought he was dating Paul's sister.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty funny.
Oh boy.
Yeah, thanks for that, Liren. Let's get to the next one. Paul Kickling, thank you for your super chat. Dr. Price, what most intrigues me is the very human emotions behind the apostles. All of them seem to fall out because of their different interpretations. This was their Gethsemane, but in the end, next super chat. Okay, I'll get to the next one. Paul Kickling, thanks again. Like Jesus, they overcame their fear and did their duty. They came to realize what they wrote, that they had to walk the walk, and they all did. Next super chat. I don't have another super chat right now. I guess you can respond to that until he continues in the next one.
Well, we don't really know anything for sure about what the apostles did. The stories that have them go into far-flung areas around the world to preach, they're laden with often absurd and fairy tale-like legends, which is not historical material. And this applies even to the martyrdoms. Like when Paul is martyred, when Nero has his head chopped off, they drag the corpse and the head out of the throne room, but then Paul, head back on his shoulders, comes right back in and threatens Nero, "You're next." Do you really think this happened? And do we have any other ancient testimony about how Paul died? It says in First Clement, whoever wrote it, there's no name on it. It says that Peter and Paul gave their final witness or were martyred because of jealousy. Well, in the apocryphal Acts of the Apostles, the jealousy was that of husbands of women alienated by the apostles for telling them that they had to renounce sex even within marriage if they wanted to be saved. And so the husbands were pretty upset about this and ratted out the apostles, who then got arrested and martyred. It just seems, and all the stuff along the way, it just seems so fake and ridiculous even that plus the sheer fact that they're depicted as going to the far corners of the earth to preach. Thomas goes to India and so forth. That seems to go against the whole idea of why there were 12 disciples / apostles. They were to sit on 12 thrones, judging, that is, governing the tribes of Israel. Well, yeah, they were to minister among fellow Jews in Palestine. Paul, not one of their number, is by contrast called the apostle to the Gentiles. Not like one of the apostles to the Gentiles, right? It's later legend that had them all going out and covering Paul's beat. So I think we really know nothing about them. In fact, there are just names on a list, basically. Peter is the only one that appears as a real character in the Gospels, but even there, he's a pure literary figment. He's just like, I know you've heard me say this a bunch of times, but he's just like Dr. Watson and Sherlock Holmes. He's got to play dumb to get Holmes to explain his thinking for the benefit of the reader. I say, Holmes, how did you deduce that little Sally was the Shropshire slasher? Elementary, my dear Watson, and so on and so on. And he explains, oh, well, that's what he's there for. He's the straight man who says, Lord, how many times must I forgive my brother if he sins against me? 7 times? And Jesus says, no. How about 70 times 7? Oh, like Jesus isn't going to say that unless somebody asks him, and they've got to ask it in a stupid way for him to correct it. I mean, it's supposed to say, well, no, I was thinking more like 78 times or 8 rather than 7. No, come on. And that's true with so many of the other ones. Look at all those Peter things. And, you finally get something right. Who do men say that I am? Well, who do you say that I am? Oh, you're the Christ. He said, keep this under your turban. Now, I got to tell you guys, the Son of Man's going to have to be arrested and beaten within an inch of his life and crucified, but he'll rise again. And Peter says, God forbid that you should get such treatment, Lord. And Jesus says, get out of my sight, Satan. Poor Peter, he manages to get it. He's like the clock that's broken, and it happens to be right once a day or whatever. So we don't really know anything about him. And it just makes you wonder if they're historical at all. Even if Jesus was, were they?
Let's get to the next one. Christopher Livinghouse, thank you for your super chat. He has no question.
Just
okay. Paul Kickling again, thank you for your super chat. Christ, the divider, divided them like they wrote, but ultimately brought them back together because there is no difference to their crucifixion in Christ.
Well, again, we don't really know what supposedly even happened to them other than these wild tales. But you could say that the crucifixion of Peter in early Christian legend, which is intimated in the Gospel of John, where he says, when you were old, you went around doing whatever you wanted to do. But when you were young, you just did whatever you wanted to do on a whim. But when you're old, people are going to lead you to places you don't want to go, and they're going to tie a rope around you to lead you like a leash. And he says, he said this to signify the manner of Peter's death. Well, that kind of implies that he's going to be taken out to be crucified as Jesus was. And, the Quo Vadis legend, where Peter is in Rome teaching, and the persecution's getting hot and heavy, and his congregants plead with him, look, you're not chickening out. We just don't want to lose you. Hit the road before they get here. And Peter is finally convinced, and so he's on the Appian Way, I guess it is, walking out of the city. No sign of the cops yet. But hey, isn't that Jesus? And Jesus comes up to him, walking the other way, and he says, Lord, what are you doing here? And Jesus says, well, somebody was due to get crucified today, but since he's not showing up, I guess I'm going to have to go to the cross again. And Peter felt ashamed and said, okay, I get your point. And he goes back into Rome and is crucified. But he insists on not getting crucified head up. He wants to be crucified upside down because he's not worthy to be in the same posture Jesus was. Well, Karl Barth said that that passage in 2 Corinthians, we're persuaded that if one died for all, then all died. So, you've undergone the punishment for sin when Jesus did, because you were sort of in his pocket at the time. Well, I guess you could say that about the apostles if they were martyred, that maybe they are sharing in the fate of Christ. In fact, in Colossians, you have this ultra weird passage where Paul, or whoever is pretending to be Paul, says, I know you've heard about my trials and tribulations, but don't worry. All I'm doing is filling up what was missing in the atonement of Christ. You were what? Let me get this straight, Peter. There was still something lacking in the atoning death of Christ that you've got to supply? Oh boy, this is not a favorite verse among any kind of Christian, right? But I think that does denote something like what you're saying, that the whole bunch of them were kind of doubles for Jesus. And in fact, I'll shut up with this, in the Apocryphal Acts, the five major ones, the Acts of Peter, of Paul, of Thomas, of John, uh, and Matthias, I think it is, Andrew and Matthias. Like clockwork, you'll find a story where Jesus appears in the likeness of the relevant apostle, and another one where the apostle appears looking like Jesus. Now, that's a real giveaway that you're erasing the line between them. But in terms of the actual behavior of the disciples, who knows?
All right, let's get to the next one. Jacob B, thank you for your super chat. Does Dr. Price think Paul is trustworthy? I question whether he had intercourse with the apostles and whether he was truthful. Seems like he had no issue lying in the service of Christ.
Well, some point to a couple of places where he says, look, contrary to popular belief, when I got converted, I did not immediately go to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before me. No. It was some years before I went to see them. I am not lying. Well, that sounds like somebody is saying that he was, but that doesn't prove that he was, right? That's a tricky thing. People get lied about all the time. Now, some people point to when he says that when I'm with Jews, I act as Jews, obeying the Torah. When I'm with Gentiles, I behave as one free from the Torah, my goal being to be all things to all men so as to reach as many as possible. This is missionary strategy even today. They say if we can somehow fit into the culture of the people among whom we're preaching, that will make communication easier. You're not lying to them, but you're trying to close the gap of strangeness. And it need mean no more than that, because Paul figured, look, we're not obliged as Christians, even Jewish ones, to keep the Torah anymore. It's fine if you want to, as part of Jewish identity, sure. But in a case like this, the gospel takes priority. And if it's easier for me to relate to Gentiles without saying, oh, gee, I'm sorry, I can't eat lunch with you. That's mighty kind of you, but I can't eat shrimp. No, as in Luke, eat whatever they set before you. Be a good guy and not some picky jerk, right? And or stuff like that, where in Galatians it comes up. Can you even, if you're a Jewish Christian, can you even eat at the same table as Gentiles? Peter and Barnabas were, and then they weren't. Paul was eating with the Gentiles. Men from James, who were sticklers, came, and Peter and Barnabas were afraid of offending them and getting into trouble. So they pretended they were too holy to eat with those unwashed Gentiles. And Paul really lets them have it. He says, well, what is this? You guys are acting like you're Gentiles yesterday, and now you're Judaizing the Gentiles. By your example, you're telling them they ought to keep Jewish customs. You're hypocrites. Well, I don't think that's lying exactly. I'd give them the benefit of the doubt. In fact, the ancient Ebionites, Jewish Christians who kept the Torah, they hated Paul and thought he was like an antichrist getting rid of the Torah. And they said, well, you know why he decided to do that, right? He's not a Jew. He decided to convert to Judaism because he fell in love with the daughter of the high priest. And of course couldn't marry her if he wasn't Jewish. So he tried being Jewish, but he just couldn't hack it. And he finally, and they said, well, then get out of here. And he said, well, I'm going to show them a thing or two. I'm going to start up a rival religion. Who knows how much of that is true, but you have to think about it when he says that he became like a Jew when he was with Jews. So what's the deal? But again, it's like when in Rome, do as the Romans do. I don't know if that's really dishonest. And though some might think it, but Are they right? I don't know. And of course, my answer to this and some of these other ones assumes that the basic picture of Paul we have in the New Testament is reliable, and I am far from sure of that. But given the way it looks on the surface, that's what I'd say.
Let's take a look at the next one. Jacob B. again, thank you for your super chat. Is the New Testament entirely a Pauline construct, or are there non-Pauline influences? What might they be?
F.C. Baur pointed out that you could really align the New Testament documents under three headings, put them into three categories. There was Jewish Christianity. Matthew's gospel would be the big Jewish gospel. Whoever keeps the least commandment, the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever teaches others not to keep them, lowest in the kingdom of heaven, and so on and so on. That's a Jewish Jesus and a Jewish gospel. Mark and John would appear to be Hellenistic gospels. I almost want to say Paul, but closer to Paul than anybody else. Probably the letter to the Hebrews would be too. It sounds much like Paul, but he didn't write it. As again, going back to the Jewish column, the Epistle of James would be another one. Hey, you think you're at liberty to keep most of the commandments, but break selected ones? I got news for you, pal. You break a single commandment, you've broken the law. It stands or falls together, and so on. And he's against Paul. He's actually quoting the Epistle to the Romans and showing how wrong he is. You foolish fellow, don't you see this and that? The book of Revelation probably would fall in the Jewish camp. It celebrates the 12 apostles. Their names are engraven on the foundation stones of the 12 gates of the New Jerusalem, but not Paul. Right? And is Paul intended to be one of the false apostles? It wouldn't be surprising, and it seems to some people think it's the earliest New Testament document because there's a kind of a raw Jewish apocalypticism about it, and so forth. So you got some Jewish and some Hellenistic or Pauline documents. The third group is Catholicizing. That is, at some point, Jewish and Hellenistic Pauline type Christianity buried the hatchet and decided to reconcile. And there was some give and take on both sides. For instance, keeping the Old Testament as part of Scripture was a concession to the Jewish Christians. The Pauline Christians like Marcion didn't really think you needed it. Why bother? But the Jewish view prevailed on them. Well, okay, what the heck? Let's have them both. And there are passages like in the two so-called Petrine epistles. Neither one of them is actually by Simon Peter, but both in different ways are trying to make Jewish Christians like and accept Paul. Now he's long dead by this time, but the point is you should reconcile with the Paulinist faction. Because they had said Paul was a persecutor. Well, what more evidence do you need? He was on the wrong side. But Paulinists were saying about Peter, that guy was a coward. He denied Jesus 3 times. Didn't Jesus say you're going to hell if you do that? Well, they decided, well, I'll accept your slur against my guy if you'll accept mine against yours. Okay, they were both sinners. Who isn't? First Peter sounds an awful lot like the letter to the Ephesians, which is heavily Paulinist, even if he didn't write it. It's based on snippets from his earlier letters. Second Peter actually refers to a collection of Paul's epistles and calls them scripture, says they're written by our beloved brother Paul. Wait a second. Paul's epistles were canonized as scripture while Peter was still alive? No way. This is a later person trying to say, Oh, Peter would approve of Paul, so you Petronists should too. So let's be one big happy family. And the pastoral epistles, First and Second Timothy and Titus, are Catholicizing. They're making Paul sound like a kind of a Catholic, early Catholic bishop. When he talks about the faith, he just means allegiance to the Christian religion or the creed, whereas in the earlier, possibly authentic Pauline epistles, it's more of an existential crisis. Like Abraham had to decide, is he going to believe this apparently absurd promise made by God? Yes, he will. He's going to take the risk, and that makes him God's friend. Well, that's what you want to do with the gospel. But it's not like that really in First and Second Timothy and Titus. It's anyway, but Luke and Acts, the point there, especially in Acts, is to parallel Peter and Paul. You ever notice that they preach the same stuff, almost in the same words? They have parallel adventures. Each of them heals a lame man. Each raises somebody from the dead. Each has a contest, a confrontation with a magician, and wins. Each has a miraculous prison escape. Each heals people in medieval weird ways. Peter by his shadow falling on the sick. Paul by sending out his handkerchiefs like Oral Roberts to put on the sick and they'll be healed. It can't be a coincidence. Somebody is trying to say, look, if you like Peter, you gotta like Paul. Look how similar he is. If you like the other one, the same thing in reverse. That can't be coincidence. So somebody is trying to say, hey, these guys are both good. They're practically the same. And so you've got the Jewish Christian category, the Hellenistic or Pauline Christianity category, and the Catholicizing category. And all the New Testament writings seem to fit pretty well into those categories, and they are rather different viewpoints. So in the Hellenistic Pauline view, it's not total agreement, but you're basically in the same ballpark.
Let's get to the next one. Liren, thank you for your super chat. He says, Ellis thinks Paul is all men, period.
Well, occasionally, like in Romans 7, he does a sort of Hamlet monologue where he says, I would like to do the right thing, but I wind up doing the wrong one despite myself. And what the heck is the matter with me? Who will free me from this incarceration and a corpse? And he says, well, thank God in Christ. Does he mean he was never able to keep the Torah? Well, if he wrote Philippians, there he says he was able to and did it perfectly. So if he wrote both, and that's a big if, some have said, and this is pretty reasonable, that in Romans, he's just using I as we might use one. One might say, I seek to do the right thing, but find that I do the wrong one. And that doesn't necessarily mean Paul, but he's doing this Hamlet-like soliloquy, and that's even now used as a rhetorical device.
Do you think when Paul says he's all things, all men, does that mean he's telling a group of people this and another group of people that, whatever to make anybody happy, kind of emphasizing on him being accused of being a liar?
Yeah, I don't think so, because I don't see the point of that. Like, why would you do that if? What are you trying to achieve by doing that? Are you trying to convert people to two different religions? I think he's saying that he's trying to do as the Romans do when he's in Rome, so as to overcome the communication gap. Plus the fact that a big issue in Paul is whether Gentiles have to keep the Jewish customs and laws. And he says, well, no, they don't, because these are only cultural now. These laws are really the ethnic markers of Jewish identity. And of course, that was an important thing for hundreds and hundreds of years because you were trying to prevent assimilation of the Jewish minority into the much more numerous pagan majority around them. And if you made it tough to do that, you were ensuring the survival of Judaism. To some degree, it was arbitrary, as even some Jewish apologists admitted. Why do the Amish use buttons or hooks in eyes rather than buttons? Well, because they're trying to be different from the elaborately uniformed Prussians who used to persecute them and had these shiny silver buttons on their tunics. Why do they not have mustaches even though they have beards? Because they don't want to be like the Prussians with their elaborate handlebar mustaches and so on. Doesn't that seem a little neurotic? I don't know. They're just trying to make a statement. We're not them. We don't want to become them. And like in the epistle of Aristeas, it makes it very clear. Why does Moses say we can't eat mice? What difference would it make? Can't eat shrimp, so what? Well, it's arbitrary. Yeah, of course it's arbitrary. You got to pick something else. But the point is, these things will separate you from the Gentiles because, what does it say? Bad company corrupts good character. And so, yeah, and Paul is saying, but you're Gentiles. And it's unrealistic and pointless to say, now you've got to behave like Jews. You're not Jews. You could become a proselyte, I guess, but you don't have to. Christ and faith in him, that's what saves. So if you become a Jew, you're going to wish you hadn't, because the mores, the customs are going to be such a burden to you. You weren't raised that way. I got to do what? Whereas Jews who were raised like a fish in water, it's no big deal to them. Why make it a big deal? And so he says, either way, it's faith in Christ that saves. If you want to preserve your Jewish ethnicity, great, go ahead and do it. And under certain circumstances, I do that. I'm proud of it. But not all the time, because I want to make clear to non-Jews that they don't have to become Jews, an alien burden to them, not to me, because that's going to be a secondary thing keeping them from Christ. At least that's the way I read it, and it's kind of a consensus among scholars. I sort of hate to agree with the consensus, but I think they're right on that one.
Let's take a look at the next one. Christopher Livinghouse, thank you for your super chat. Dr. Bob, thanks for your help with my research topic. What are your thoughts on the Hebraic version of Matthew, specifically 11:11? Also, could this be a Q source, as Papias might have discovered?
Well, yeah, Papias does talk about Matthew having written the gospel in Hebrew, and several others doing their best to translate it into Greek. And that's fascinating but confusing, because there's several documents that some of the early church fathers identified with, or should we say nominated to be the Hebrew Matthew. And it turns out that they were probably thinking about different versions of a gospel variously known as the gospel according to the Hebrews, the gospel according to the Ebionites, and the gospel according to the Nazarenes, which were probably had the same sort of relation to one another as the three synoptics do. There's interdependence, but there's enough's been added or subtracted that each one has its own voice. So it's probably the case with these gospels. But was there, and our present Greek Matthew seems surely to have been based on the Greek Gospel of Mark. But there are a couple of old, one I think medieval and one somewhat older than that, versions of Matthew in Hebrew, which look like they may have been translations of the Greek Gospel into Hebrew. that would be something like what Russell Gamirkin is saying about the Torah. That was it really originally in Hebrew and then translated into Greek, or were both versions done at the same time somehow? It's not that clear, and it isn't in this either. But the 11:11 thing, I think, is the one where Jesus is talking about John the Baptist, and in the Hebrew Gospel, it says something about how that John the Baptist was the greatest, and they should have heeded him. Whereas in the Greek version, it subordinates Jesus to John by implication. And that's something you wouldn't think some Christian translator would have snuck in. That does really imply a really intriguing possibility that this was a group of Jewish Christians who still had one foot in the John the Baptist camp. So interesting. George Howard wrote a couple of books about this. He wrote an article for me for the Journal of Higher Criticism also. Fascinating stuff.
Jacob B., thank you for your super chat. If we could look into Paul's mind, what exactly was Christ crucified to Paul? What was he envisioning? What did he mean?
Well, the scandal of the cross is usually, which he says in First Corinthians, he says that we preach Christ crucified, which is nonsense to Greeks and scandalous to Jews, because Jews want to see miracles authenticating the truth. Greeks want philosophical argument. Well, we have neither. All we preach is Christ crucified. We don't use fancy rhetoric or wisdom, because if we did, if we persuaded you, as if we're persuading you to buy a product or to sign on to some new philosophy, eventually, that might not stick. Okay, suppose Paul leaves and Apollonius of Tyana shows up next week, and he makes a pretty good argument for Neo-Pythagoreanism. Well, you might be fickle and say, hey, this sounds pretty good to me, and convert. No, what you needed was a display of the power of God in his spirit, and that's what you had. And this, of course, I think is a dangerous notion. It's allowing emotion to substitute for reason. But he was shrewd psychologically in saying that if somebody is emotionally converted to something, reason is not going to get him out of it. It didn't get him into it. Well, so he says that the Christ crucified was a scandal to Jews, a stumbling block. Same word in Greek, skandalon. Why? Well, of course, the way we usually take it is, wasn't the Messiah, the Christ, supposed to be a righteous warrior who would kick the butts of the Roman oppressors? A Messiah might do a lot of things, but getting handed over to the pagans and crucified, that's the last thing he would do. And so, yet here we are saying, yeah, he's the real one. Like in Luke, he brilliantly turns this right around. The disciples on the road to Emmaus say, well, we had hoped this was the guy that was going to free Israel, but I guess not, in light of the events of this past weekend. And Jesus says, you fools, don't you see in the scriptures that the Messiah had to suffer and only then enter into his glory? In other words, it's not like these events, awful as they were, debunked Jesus' claim to be the Messiah. No, if he hadn't have been crucified, he'd have been exposed as a false Messiah. Don't you see? And he explains all the prophecies that supposedly predict that. And eventually, holy mackerel, in a moment of realization, they're converted. Well, I don't know if that really holds water, but that's the way it happens. The people that are really attached to it are attached because of experience and so forth. Okay, so those were attempts to make the scandal non-scandalous. There's another thing. I read a book recently called Messiah ben Joseph. there was attested in about the 3rd century AD or CE a Jewish belief that there were to be two messiahs, a Messiah from the north, Messiah, son of the patriarch Jacob. Remember how his brothers had visions of him ruling the world and all that stuff? Well, that implies there was a kind of a Joseph messianism. And they eventually figured this Messiah is going to die and in battle. And why does he have to die? Well, because in that death, he will atone for the sins of Israel, which up to that point had stayed God's hand. Sinful Israel was not worthy of deliverance until they all repented, or failing that, Messiah ben Joseph took the punishment for their sins in a glorious battle of field death. And then he'd be replaced by the Messiah ben David. He would be the righteous, godly warrior who would defeat the Romans and restore the kingdom to Israel. And some Jewish interpreters have said, well, if you take a very close look at Jewish lore through the centuries, which he goes over in great detail, says you'll see that the idea of the suffering Messiah as a preliminary is much older than we've given credit for. It goes way back into Judaism. And Jews might want to explore the possibility that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah, son of Joseph, and that our Jewish Messiah, who is yet to come, is the Messiah, son of David. Maybe we don't have anything to argue over. Well, obviously, Luke didn't look at it that way, but that's another way of dealing with it. But it seems, if you're taking the usual superhero version of the Messiah, you wouldn't think this could possibly be right. You'd say, this has got to be one of the most elaborate cognitive dissonance fantasies ever cooked up. Oh, well, he was the Messiah, all right, but there were extenuating circumstances. Maybe that was involved in the scandal of the cross. Now, who crucified him? In 1 Thessalonians, it says that the Jews put him to death, which implies some sort of passion narrative like in the Gospels. But many scholars think that passage is an interpolation. I won't get into that. Others say the whole letter is post-Pauline. But in Colossians and 1 Corinthians, it speaks of Jesus being crucified by what sound like angelic superhuman entities, the archons who rule this world. Crucified him in 1 Corinthians. In Colossians, the principalities and powers got together to crucify him, the fallen angels. So does he mean they were the powers behind the throne that manipulated Pilate and Caiaphas into having Jesus killed? Or does he mean that he's thinking of a cosmic thing like in the book of Revelation, where you see the lamb that was slain up in heaven, bleeding and all that? We don't really know. It's quite fascinating. We're not really sure what Paul thought, or again, which document actually goes back to him.
All righty, let's take a look at the next one. Paul Kickling, thank you for your super chat. In Matthew 10 and Luke 12, Christ the divider passages, their own truth came true. All the apostles fell out as friends due to their idea of Christ.
Do we know that they did? I mean, where is the evidence for that? It doesn't really happen in the Gospels. They scatter like the sheep when the shepherd is taken out, it says. But they supposedly all get back together to figure out what to do next. I don't know that that's part of the story, really. And Christ divides in this, well, the members of families. and it's easy to know what that means. I mean, it's based on something I think from Amos. He just quotes something from Amos. I've come to set the father-in-law against the daughter-in-law, and so on and so on. A man's enemies shall be those of his own household. Well, that seems to refer to times of persecution where Christians are under the gun, but their relatives aren't. And why should they be persecuted? Why should they get killed? And they're trying to plead with the Christian, don't do it. Like the great martyrdom story of Saint Perpetua, 2nd century. This Roman young matron is a Christian. She's in jail. She's pregnant. She gives birth while she's in jail, and she's about to go into the arena to be eaten by leopards and bears and stuff. And her family comes to her and says, please don't do this. If not for our sake, for your son's. He needs you. Don't go out there and throw away your life. And she says, I'm sorry, I have to be a soldier for Christ. And she does, and she gets martyred. Well, that's kind of like what it's talking about, that it's come down to it where you got to go one way or the other. There's a, what am I thinking of? I slipped right out of my head, but I think there's another good example of this where in the New Testament where you have to make the choice of Christ. Well, like, Lord, I will follow you, but first let me bury my father. That might mean he hasn't got long to live. Can I wait until he dies and then I'll come? Who knows? And Jesus says, nothing doing. You can't put your hand to the plow and then look back if you want to plow a straight furrow. Let the dead bury their own dead. You come and preach the kingdom. Whoa! It doesn't get more drastic than that. But he says, look, we're talking about the big time here, the coming of the kingdom of God. Your first duty is now to that. There's no future, a worldly future to even contemplate. Then it's funny you mentioned this, though. There is another one where Jesus, maybe this is the Luke 12 thing you're talking about, where this guy approaches Jesus and says, Master, make my brother divide the inheritance with me. He won't do it. And Jesus, because they know, like, saints and people like that who couldn't be bribed and were wise would give good judgment on things like this. That's a very ancient practice. But Jesus repudiates it. He says, who made me a judge or arbiter over you? And in the Gospel of Thomas, he then turns to the disciples and says, I'm not an arbiter, am I? I love that little touch. So there's one where he refuses the role of an arbiter, but whether he divides the apostles, that I don't really, that doesn't ring a bell with me in the Gospels.
All right, let's get to the next one. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. I think it's outrageous the creator of the universe can have books written so poorly and with mistakes all over the place. Thank you, Mr. Price, helping us see these things.
Yeah, and Clark Pennock, the great evangelical theologian and a good friend of mine, I don't have good guys and bad guys in religion or theology, right? I don't care what you believe, that's up to you. But Clark said the fundamentalists don't like the Bible they've got. And he used to be one. And he what he's thinking is that it doesn't really match up to the PR they give it. They've defined it in such an abstract, perfect way that this book written by humans, even if they were inspired, just doesn't live up to it. most Christians of any stripe would say, well, of course, human beings wrote it, and it bears the marks of that. Different literary styles. Paul sounds different than John, of course. But nonetheless, they wrote what God wanted them to write. Well, yeah, but you can't really solve it that easily because you do find contradictions on important matters and not just irrelevant details, right? Did Jesus heal the blind man on the way into Jericho or on the way out of Jericho? God, who cares? Is the mustard seed really the smallest seed on planet Earth, as Jesus says? Who cares? That's not the point. He's not teaching you biology or botany, right? So, yeah, you can even sweep a lot of that out of the way. But when you, like, can you get a divorce? According to Mark and Luke, no. According to Luke, yes. No, I'm sorry. Matthew says yes. What are you supposed to do? I mean, if this book is supposed to be the infallible oracle to tell you what to do and believe, you're kind of up the creek on these matters. And all right, maybe in some big matters, there aren't any overt, obvious contradictions, but that's almost moot. Because if in any such thing you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, you got direction signs pointing in two different directions, that alone, regardless of how important that issue is, it sort of undermines the idea that I can just open the Bible and find the will of God. Well, maybe you can't. Maybe you're going to have to backpedal like a lot of theologians do and say, well, the Bible simply records the pious opinions of wise and holy men. And so it's the ball is thrown into our court. Well, that's not too far from what I think. But then again, I don't think the Bible is she who must be obeyed, as the saying goes. If you're just saying it's a resource with a lot of ideas, many of which are very wise, well, all right. If you're reading wise stuff, the whole idea is you don't have to take it on faith. It rings true to you. Wouldn't you be better off forgiving somebody than seething with rage, as Woody Allen says, grow a tumor? Isn't it obvious that's what you want to do? And you think to yourself, well, it isn't obvious, but now that you mention it, I guess so. I mean, that's the way wisdom literature works. And it tells you something you could have arrived at for yourself, but you haven't. And once you hear it, wow, why didn't I think of that? And if that's the authority of the Bible, I'm all for it. But that's not what you're getting when you say that God, in effect, wrote this book and it's infallible. You might as well just come off it. You're making an idol of the Bible. As Tillich said, anything you raise above criticism, you have made into an idol. So
let's get to the next one. Vesper, thank you for your super chat. In Luke, it seems Jesus had reversed the Essene sacrament by having wine and then beer and then bread. Is the reason Paul flipped it back because he was a Pharisee?
Well, this the Eucharistic thing in First Corinthians is another one of these maddening things where there are two different textual traditions. And as it now reads, you've got cup, bread, and cup again. Well, not all manuscripts have the whole thing. And so what was the original reading? And so that's not clear. But the whole thing is ambiguous and confusing enough that I would hesitate to be too sure about any inference that he was changing it. There's a great book, The Essene Origin of Christianity. I don't think that's it. Oh boy. I can't think of the authors either. There are two of them. These guys make this amazing case that Christianity did start as a split off of Essenism. Let me just see if I can find this. I think maybe I can. Let's see. I'll be very lucky if I can do this. Oh boy. It's in my book. I discuss it in my book, Judaizing Jesus. Ooh. No, I'm never going to find it. But the thing is, they note that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we're told that the community would celebrate Pentecost every 50 days as a celebration of the giving the Torah at Sinai. And this would involve the bread and the cup. And it didn't really have to do with Passover. And the Christian Eucharist, though it is interpreted as a new Passover a couple of times in the New Testament, seems actually to fit the Pentecost, periodic Pentecost feasts of the Essenes, and nobody else. Maybe I can remember to look this up before next time. And he says it does kind of look like that that they did change the meaning of it and kept it going, but that must be where they got it from. So I'll just have to look that up on my failing memory at fault here.
Well, let's get to the next one then. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. When will your new book be out?
I've kind of forgotten whether it's supposed to be this fall, which would make it any time, or in January. It's probably the latter. And that's going to be the book, The Gospels Behind the Gospels, where I give a whole new paradigm for the materials in the Gospels and how they've all kind of been reshuffled from different sources, and that they yield several different coherent Christologies. And the assumption is that the evangelists use source documents in which each one of these, in which materials were taken that attest these various Christologies and are lumped together, forming a whole new pattern in each one. And I also deal with a similar puzzle from 1 Corinthians, where Paul says, I hear that there are divisions among you, my brethren, and I half believe it's true. For one says, I am of Paul, another, I am of Cephas, another, I am of Apollos, another, I am of Christ. What? Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you, etc.? And I've always thought this is very strange. How isn't he putting Christ on the same level with these others? I mean, would any Christian as we know him say that Peter and Christ are on a par? Or that Paul, you got to choose between Paul and Christ? And so I posit that this stems from an earlier time when these four were rival figureheads of different movements and were pretty much on a par. And just as John the Baptist and Jesus were at one point. But eventually the Jesus sect wins out and co-opts the John sect. And so John is subordinated to Jesus as his cousin and his front man. And I think that has happened so that Paul becomes an apostle of Jesus, but there are clues that once it was different. And I try to develop that a good bit. And I think you're going to find a lot of eye-opening stuff, at least thought-provoking. I'm working on another one now. I'm not sure how long it's going to take me to finish this, but I'm really having fun with it, and I think it's going to be a real unusual book. It's called Houses of the Holy, a higher critical survey of world religions. And I'm going to cover the big ones and the smaller ones and various sectarian split-offs from them. Unification Church, Mormons, Sufis, etc., and deal with the founders. Were they legends or real people? What do we know about the sources for their lives and teachings? And I want to bring up elements that are just never addressed in these more broad, general introductions to religion, like Houston Smith's. I mean, they're good as intros to people that really don't know anything about it and want a basic course in it, and that's good. But I'm doing a different sort of a thing, assuming you know something about them, but we're going over what you do know and a whole mess of things you don't. And I'm working on Islam right now, and oh, it is fascinating. I don't know when that's going to be, but I keep mentioning one tentatively titled "Not Peace But a Sword," and my collaborator has my draft, and we'll see what he adds to it. And I'm not really sure when that's coming out. I don't have much of an idea.
Let's get to the next one. Paul Kickling, thank you for your super chat. That higher knowledge cannot be comprehended by lesser evolved minds, causing them to crucify it into dualism. Thus, a coming of Christ can cause sin. So Christ is spiritual growth, anthropomorphized.
Well, that's I see that kind of at work in what Simeon says to Mary and Joseph in the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, when he says, your child will be a sign spoken against. I remember I did a sermon on this once, and I said it's as if and I compared it to Bishop Spong, who was in big controversy again at the time, and when he ordained a gay bishop or something. And I said, well, you got to say, whether you agree with him or not, he is forcing certain issues to be addressed, and he's becoming a sign spoken against, as Jesus did, which we can always use. And so he's like a standard. If the country is in revolution, the revolutionaries will have a banner and to act as a standard to which to rally. Do you go with the old or with the new? Well, rally around the flag. That, I think that is kind of like Jesus, the Buddha, and others saying, wake up out of your complacency. Here's a bomb I'm tossing at you. Think fast, make a decision, because the time is up. You must. And so he is a divider in that sense. And so you're going to find people that'll say, I'm sorry, I just can't go along with that. And I think you're crazy if you do. And so you're going to, again, split people's loyalties. And then you find this with the weaker and stronger brethren in Romans and First Corinthians, which is really the basis of Gnosticism, the idea that most people are the psychikoi, the soulish or natural ones. They're conventionally religious, and their religion helps them to be moral. It's wholesome, but it's ultimately not quite true. There is a higher truth unsuspected by them. And the stronger brethren know it and live by it and have to be careful about what they say, because it will be so incomprehensible to the weaker brethren who hear it, if they do, that they will want to persecute you. That's blasphemy. No, it's not. I wish you could see that, but they can't. And I think this is where we get the thing that where Jesus says, be careful not to throw your pearls before swine and holy food to dogs, lest they trample it underfoot, turn on you, and tear you to pieces. I just think that is a warning about don't say the higher truth you know to people you really can be pretty sure are not going to get it. You're risking goading them into actions that you'll both regret. Keep your mouth shut until you happen to spot somebody who seems to be ready. But other than that, you're doing nobody any favor by blurting out what you know. Like in Thomas 13, right? Jesus comes up to Thomas and well, he says to the disciples, make a comparison. Tell me who I'm like. Peter says, you're like a righteous angel. Matthew says, you're like a wise philosopher. And Thomas says, Master, my mouth cannot put into words what you're like. And Jesus says, blessed are you, for you have drunk from the spring that I have ladled out. Don't call me your master. And he takes him away a short distance and tells him three things, which it does not share with the reader. Well, Jesus then leaves, and the disciples regather around Thomas and say, oh, what was it? What did he say to you? And Thomas says to him, I'm sorry, guys, but if I were to tell you even one of the things he told me, you would try to stone me to death. But fire would erupt from the stones and consume you. Wow. It's like, it's hush, hush. You cannot understand it. I'm lucky I can, but I know well enough what'll happen if I tell anybody else. And so, yeah, there's Christ the divider. And so that's the sense I make of that.
Let's get to the next one. Jacob B., thank you for your super chat. How could Christians get the notion of the Messiah and messianic prophecy so wrong and strained if they were actually originally Jews?
Well, this is possibly where the Messiah ben Joseph thing comes in. If that was known as a possible messianic concept, and apparently there were several. Princeton University Press printed up the papers from some big convocation they had years ago about the Messiah. And their point was to try to show how there were very different concepts of the Messiah among Jews. Like in Qumran, there are two Messiahs, a royal one and a priestly one. There's something like that intimated in Zechariah. There's there's the Messiah ben Joseph and Messiah ben David thing. And so it's possible some understood that, and that's where Jesus' father being named Joseph really comes from. I think Hugh Schoenfield thought that it was really a statement that he was the Galilean Messiah, the northern Messiah, not the militaristic Judean Messiah, the new David. The Samaritans believed in the coming of the Taheb, the restorer, who would be the return of Moses or a new prophet like Moses or Joshua, perhaps. So there were in ongoing centuries, there were Kabbalistic mystics who were thought to be the Messiah, though it's a little hard to find that in the Bible. Or Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson a few years ago, very saintly character, very holy man. Many of his followers, he was the head of the Lubavitcher Hasidim, and a lot of them said, I bet Rebbe is the Messiah. But he never said that. He never bothered to refute it or accept it. And after he died, they began to say, okay, I'm pretty sure he is the Messiah, and he's going to shortly come back. In fact, I bet he was God incarnate. These are Hasidic Jews saying this, right? Where did they get that? Well, eventually you get the impression that any kind of real charismatic, pivotal figure could be understood to be the Messiah. And so it seems like there was enough flexibility in the concept or even like the one reading of the passage where Jesus exorcises a demon, and the crowd is really hepped up about it. And one guy says, marveling, he says, "Isn't this the son of David?" Well, does he mean the Messiah, son of David, the warrior? What would that have to do with exorcism? Do we know a famous exorcist who was David's son? Sure we do. Solomon, right? Everybody considered him to be a great magician. How the heck did he get that temple built? What was it? Aliens with anti-gravity technology? That's what people would say today. But they said, well, no, he commanded demons to carry these huge stone blocks over and build the thing. So that, and he was a great pious sorcerer. There are grimoires supposedly written by him: the Testament of Solomon, the Greater Key of Solomon, the Lesser Key of Solomon, and so on and so on and so on. And in fact, in my book, Holy Fable, Volume 1, I have a section on the Testament of Solomon, even though it isn't exactly in the Bible, but it kind of illustrates some things that are. So I would suggest that. But if you're like the crucified Messiah thing, if you were so sold, it could be considered cognitive dissonance resolution. If you were so committed to this guy as the herald of the kingdom of God, and it's going to happen soon, and crucified, you would very likely come up with a face-saving rationalization. And people have done this many times. One of the sections of my world religions book about Islam covers many guys in India who came forward as the Mahdi, the Islamic Messiah analog. And a lot of these guys were killed by the British authorities and so on, but that's okay. They'll be back, etc. People will not give up. And so, that could be it was a scandal of the cross, all right, but there might be a way out of it. And so I think the flexibility of it allows for almost anything.
Let's get to the next one. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chats. Quite a big super chat there. For some reason, this mention of Apollos reminds me of the modern tea patriots and others that eventually lost out and faded away into obscurity. Jesus' movement just got by while the others lost to history. Can't wait for the new book.
Yeah, that's often been used by apologists to say, why isn't there any religion of Theudas the magician, or the Egyptian prophet, or the Samaritan Taheb? I mean, these guys were sort of analogous to Jesus, but like Gamaliel says in Acts 4 or 5, I forget which, that they came to a bad end and their movements just dried up and blew away. Well, you can't assume the same thing happens all the time. The teacher of righteousness was killed, but that didn't stop the Essene movement. I mean, it was snuffed out of existence years or decades later, but his death didn't destroy him. And or the Buddha, he died, but he had done his work real well, and Buddhism survives to this day as a major religion. So it doesn't have to happen the same way all the time. Like, was there any real teaching associated with some of these other guys? If there was, and people liked it, that might be the glue that would hold them together. But if all they were miracle mongers saying, okay, everybody watch this, I'm going to prove I'm the Messiah and we're going to march into Jerusalem, and oops, well, then that's that. I mean, what is there to hold on to? But with Jesus and John the Baptist and even Simon Magus, we're actually given samples of the stuff they supposedly said that attracted disciples. And even without the leader anymore, if they had done their work well, they're still going to, the movement might still thrive.
All right, let's get to the next one. Kevin Donnie, thank you for your super chat. Dr. Bob, if you are looking for book titles, I always thought Deconverting Jesus would be a great name for a book. Use it if you like. Keep up the good work.
Thanks. I wonder what you have in mind, though. Imagining Jesus changing religions or deconverting from faith in Jesus.
I wonder about myself, but he doesn't say enough there to tell. Maybe he'll
It's worth
explain
thinking
later.
about. Yeah, people might confuse with my deconstructing Jesus, but that's kind of the point. I realize a variation on the theme. Yeah, I'll have to think about that. Thank you.
Let's get to the next one. Paul Kickling, thank you for your super chat. Have you noticed in Watchmen, the ending is the same case? Rorschach, keeping the truth alive, forces the world to face this higher truth.
Yeah, he takes his diary, knowing that his days may be numbered, and sends it to this radical newspaper, and that a lot of people would just think is the National Enquirer or something. And in it, he tells about the whole scheme of Adrian Veidt, Ozymandias, and the nature of the hoax that he's going to use to try to unite humanity and avert a world war by making them to get together to build defenses against an alien invasion, which he is just like a hoax. It's based on the first episode of Outer Limits, Architects of Fear, and there's a link to that in the movie of Watchmen. And this, nobody suspected this. And once this paper, Rorschach is killed by Dr. Manhattan, and but the diary gets to the paper and they publish it, and now Ozymandias, once a hero, is vilified as a mass murderer because he wound up killing millions of people with this phony invasion thing. And then in the sequel, written decades later, Doomsday Clock, Ozymandias decides to skip the universe and come to the main DC universe, and it is, both of them are sublime, and Rorschach is the guy, one guy in one gesture who changes the world, and that's really great stuff. I love that. I'm glad you're a Watchmen fan.
Paul Kickling, thank you for your super chat again. Rorschach, black and white, dualist division from Platonic truth. So the apple in Eden was a truth bomb, and their minds could not handle it without sinning.
That's right, because I mean, the whole thing is priestcraft, as they used to say. It's clear to me, as it was to the Nag Hammadi authors, like the guy that wrote, I think it was The Testimony of Truth. He's retelling the Genesis Eden story, and he says how God tells him, don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and if you do, you'll die. And of course they don't, and who's telling the truth here? It's the serpent, it's not God. And the author comments, what kind of a God is this is word for word? What kind of a God is this? Is he not a malicious grudger? Yeah, he doesn't want them to have higher knowledge that he has. And then the story is replayed in chapter 11 with the Tower of Babel. Right? Jehovah thinks he's crippled the human race so that they cannot challenge the gods, but he sees, oh my gosh, look at this. They're building this huge tower. I never thought they were capable of this. If this goes on, there's nothing these creatures won't be able to accomplish. And so he consults with the other gods, and this is just right in Genesis. He says, "Hey, I got it. Let's go down and confuse their languages so they can't work together." And they do, and everybody is saying, what is this? We can't get along. Okay, sayonara, I'm out of here. My family and I'll go settle somewhere, and we'll teach our kids our language. Whoa. Who is interested in saying God wants to hobble human intelligence and initiative? Well, the rulers who don't want to be unseated. And that, in this case, overlapped with the priestly establishment. Like, there's knowledge we have because we're the sacred elite, just like the Brahmin caste in India, that we don't want these common slobs knowing, because if they do know it, they won't need us anymore. And so they're going to keep everybody in the dark. Things haven't changed much. Yeah, boy, that is the truth bomb. Like, God wants to prevent propagation by the human race. He didn't even intend to have a female to begin with. He just took pity on the man, the only one he intended to be the caretaker of Eden, because he figured the guy's bored most of the time. I'll make a friend for him. And he tries it by creating animals. None of them can speak, at least that's what I think is wrong. And so he says, well, every time I make something directly from the ground, it's different. I need something like him. Well, how about if I take a piece of him and build another one like him? And that's what happens with his wife, right? And the narrator interrupts himself and says, "Aha! Now this is why the sexes get together. They have this desire for one another, and so on." And it doesn't say God said, "Be fruitful and multiply." That was a different creation story in chapter 1. In this one, that's the last thing he wants, because once the serpent clues him in on the knowledge tree, and Jehovah finds out about that, I guess a little alarm goes off. He says to the other gods, "Uh-oh, look at this. Their eyes are opened. They've become like us, knowing good and evil." That's just what the serpent said would happen, right? And so what does he do? He says, before they can eat from the tree of life and live forever, we got to get them out of here. And he does. Because what will happen? Well, if they gain immortality and know everything the gods know and can endlessly multiply, they're going to create a vast race of gods who will outnumber and overcome Jehovah and his buddies. And so, yeah, we don't want you to have too much knowledge, because you'll use it for nefarious purposes, at least what we think of as nefarious. So exactly, that's what happens. He's just like Prometheus, and I say he's another version of the Prometheus myth. So yeah, I think you're exactly right.
Let's get to the next one. Stephen Wright, thank you for your super chat. Once heard a sermon that the Apollos person mentioned by Paul could have wrote the book of Hebrews. Wonder your thoughts. Thanks for your work.
Oh, thank you. Well, yeah, that's one of the best guesses. I sort of think Martin Luther might have thought that. But Apollos is said to have been an Alexandrian and a scripture expert, which kind of demands that we picture him as like Philo. Possibly he's supposed to be Philo, and whom Eusebius thought was a Christian and met Peter. And of course, why would he think that? Well, just read Philo and read the Gospel of John. That the Christology is already there, the Logos and all that. Let's see. And so he's an allegorist in all probability. Oh, it says this literally, but it really means this higher truth. Well, we have something like that in Hebrews, don't we, with the earthly tabernacle and the heavenly tabernacle. And of course, you don't have to be Philo to make that distinction. Exodus already has the heavenly tabernacle that is the blueprint for the earthly copy. I mean, that's already there in the Bible. But the idea that Jesus was doing a saving work up there, not so much down here, you could kind of read him as a Philonic character. And so he'd be a good one. Others thought Barnabas wrote it. And that would also make sense because at least once the 12th chapter was tacked on to make what looks like it was originally an essay into a letter, though incompletely since there's no salutation on the front end of it. But that last chapter refers to other people in the Pauline circle, and who would that? It would be somebody, chances are, whom we would know from Paul's letters or Acts. And so some have said, well, Barnabas, he certainly was Paul's right-hand man. Maybe he wrote it. Well, that's certainly not outrageous either. Some have said Clement of Rome did. Well, because there's some hints that it may have been written from Rome. Everybody in Rome salutes you. And that's conceivable, but I don't think we know enough about Clement to make much difference. I don't know if it really sheds any light on it, even if it was by Clement. So Apollos, I think, is a good one. Harnack made an amazingly cogent argument that it was written by Priscilla, who is mentioned in Romans 16 and in the book of Acts. She and her husband, Aquila, were apostolic characters and preachers that worked with Paul for a while. And I really cannot, I don't have the time or the energy to go into the whole thing, but in the preface to Hebrews, in the pre-Nicene New Testament, and also I think in the third volume of Holy Fable, I try to summarize Harnack's argument. The guy had X-ray vision. He had just amazing sight to pick up details and to say, now, why is this here? What would this have to mean? And he says he thinks that it was probably written by Priscilla and that her name has been omitted as the church got more chauvinistic. Take a look at what I've written about it. It summarizes Harnack. So she's a very good candidate. So we'll never know. And like Origen said, God only knows who wrote the Epistle to the Hebrews, which of course is a way of saying nobody knows who wrote it, right? No human being knows. And we'll probably never know. It doesn't say so in any manuscript. So, but I guess enough of that one. Thanks for the chat.
Let's take a look at this next super chat. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for another very big super chat. Charles Taze Russell was a millionaire, but the 1914 debacle and his death in 1917. If it wasn't for his money, the Bible students would have died, in my opinion. Too bad. Roofer fraud brought them back, naming them Jehovah's Witness later.
Yeah, this was an interesting thing. Russell's father, I believe, was a minister, and he preached about hell. And Charles figured, that's really monstrous. Does the Bible really teach that? And so he became a really attentive Bible student and said, let me take a new look at this. And he came up with Arian Christology and with annihilationism. And there's certainly scriptural bases for both. And of course, he was also, millenarian. He believed that the end was coming very soon, and he opened up these Bible study centers, and people flocked to him. Apparently, probably partly attracted by the prospect of not having to go to hell. And I don't know really what led everybody to it, but of course it has succeeded fantastically. It's really like Mormonism. It's like a world religion in its own right. And I have to say, I think Judge Rutherford may have been a con man. I don't really know much about him either, but he's gone too now. Two things I always say about the witnesses. Well, no, three of them really. They got a lot of guts to go door to door. I mean, I've done that as a fundamentalist Baptist decades ago. You can get used to it, but people are going to think you are a lunatic, and but you're going to bear that shame if you have to preach the gospel. I have to hand them that they're really gutsy people. Second, their Bible is not the tissue of distortions people like to say it is. There's a book by Jason Bedune called Truth in Translation. I mention this occasionally, where he picks a bunch of passages that are translated in different ways by different versions, and he compares like about 10 versions with their readings and says, now, which one's really closer? And again, he shows why the Jehovah's Witnesses New World Translation seems to be the fairest of the bunch, how people are kind of cheating. It's really eye-opening. Okay, and the third thing is, I know people who were raised in the Jehovah's Witnesses, and it really taught them character. That they really learned how to be a man or a woman in it, and they eventually saw through some of the doctrine they didn't agree with, and they chafed under the totalitarian control, which I don't appreciate much, and quit eventually. But they still have good things to say about the way they were brought up with good values. And so, I got more good than bad to say about them. The bad stuff people say is often true, but there's certainly a good side to the witnesses.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Dr. Price.
Oh, my pleasure.
And I want to thank everybody for the healthy amount of super chats I got today. I really appreciate it. There was a lot of super chats. And I'll see everybody later. Thanks again, Dr. Price.
Oh, thank you.
Of course.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.